Hi. Good morning. My name is Rachel WERCZBERGER. I'm chairing this session. We have a wonderful session called, under the title of Case Studies 1, which means we have 4 different lectures on very different topics, though, of course, discussing new religious movements, each one of them. Each one of them sounds exciting and fascinating. I'm looking forward to hearing those lectures. Our format will be half an hour per each lecture, which means about 20 minutes lecture and then 10 minutes questions and answers. So our first lecture is by Zoe ALDERTON. Zoe is from Sydney University, Department of Writing Studies. She studies, among her different topics, she studies eating disorders from a religious and cultural perspective. And she will talk about ANA and MEIDA, subtle deification processes amongst high-demand eating disorder communities.
Much easier. All right, thank you everyone for being here. Now, for some of you, you may remember back to my presentation for CESNUR in 2015 in Estonia. And back then I had started this project. And I noted that there were quite a few self-harm and eating disorder communities online that were displaying behaviours that were similar to those of religious groups. So they certainly had religious or spiritual aspects to them, but nothing that was necessarily formally a religion. So we had things like wound veneration, bone cults, things like that were smaller aspects of a larger whole. But after getting into this topic a bit more, I've now found, it's relatively well hidden, but I've now found several decades worth of eating disorder communities. And within these communities, we can see beliefs and behaviours that suit even the more conservative definitions of religion. So we're definitely in the territory of what can be described as religion with the material that I'm going to show you today. To give you a bit of a feel of how common it is, it's very difficult to get an understanding of how many pro-eating disorder communities there are online. There's hundreds of thousands, but of course they open and shut at quite rapid rates. But we do know that about 20% of them have religious content, and by religious content I mean their own religion, not content that pertains to other pre-existing religions. So in this presentation, I'm going to take you through those different aspects of religion that we see in these sites. So I'll introduce you to the goddesses ANAMADIM, who is the oldest, and the more recent present generation goddesses ANA and MEIDA. And these goddesses have cults, they have creeds, commandments, rituals for summoning. And in addition to that, they give their followers a set of daily rules. They give them quite strong moral guidelines. And they also provide them with a very strong sense of identity. So again, it's the same kind of outcomes that we do see from a typical religion. So, in order to give you a bit of a background into eating disorders online, we do have a very, very large community of people with eating disorders who have come together. A lot of people enter into these communities because they're searching for information about their condition or about treatment, but many of them will then fall into circles that start promoting eating disorders as a lifestyle, more than suggesting that the participant move away into a state of healing. So a lot of them are against that kind of typical medical model of what an eating disorder is. Now, participants in pro-eating disorder groups, they often view anorexia or bulimia as legitimate alternative eating patterns as opposed to dangerous illnesses. And we see them discussing the philosophies behind starvation or thinness. We see a lot of tips for extreme weight loss, ways to trick the body by doing things like eating soap or sponges, tips for hiding starvation from parents because a lot of these people are minors, and friends, and also a lot of inspiration from other members of the community, or photographs of emaciated bodies, which are generally known as thinspiration. Portmanteau there of thin and inspiration. So that's what you can find fairly easily with these sites. This kind of content isn't locked down too much, but the more that you scratch the surface, the more you realise that behind these sort of overarching philosophies of you should be thin and here are some tips for achieving it, we do actually see some quite rigorous religious structures appearing in as was stated, about 20% of these sites, which is substantial. Now, in terms of who is using these websites, there's a pretty clear demographic of people. Obviously, as with any group, there are exceptions, but when we look at the averages, most of the people who are in pro-eating disorder groups have had an eating disorder for around 7 years. So we have people who've been ill for quite a large portion of their lives. They tend to be in high school or in university. They also tend to be white, and the majority of them live in the US. But we also see quite a few people from the UK, and Australia and New Zealand are quite overrepresented considering our relatively small population bases. So that gives you a feeling for the kind of main people that you are likely to see participating. We also have a really, really strong gender bias. So the vast majority of people who own and moderate pro-eating disorder sites are female, and the vast majority of users as well are female. So when we tally this all together, we get a pretty good picture of who's involved in the religions that I'm about to take you through. So the average person who's exposed to them is a young white woman. She studies. She may have actually quite a high level of education. She tends to speak English. There are some French, German, and Italian circles, but English is the prevailing language. And importantly, she's someone who's likely to have been ill for a very large portion of her life. So in some cases, about half of her lifespan to a third of her lifespan. So a very, very significant amount of time suffering from an extremely serious psychiatric illness, which anorexia nervosa in particular is. Now, the first deity who appeared in this milieu, and she seems to have appeared around the year 2001, is the goddess ANAMADIM. And she had a cult developed to her quite early, and she's been described as the guardian servitor of the anorectic praxis. And you can see a picture of her here up on the right. She's quite a sort of typical fairy imagery. Starving for the other shore, quite sort of supernatural ideas coming through. And also we've got some repetitions and some creeds emerging as well. So say it now, say it loud, I'm anorexic and I'm proud, comes from a general protest chant, but it's something that we do see repeated frequently in a lot of these communities, particularly as they become very, very interested in the idea of creating creeds for their followers. So this gives you a bit of an idea of at least one person's imagining of ANAMADIM. She appears differently to different people, but generally you'll see her represented as a very thin, young, very beautiful woman. So the original cult to ANAMADIM was created on a website called Anna's Underground Grotto, and we know it ran from 2001 to 2006. It's difficult to find it, but I have dug up a decent amount of it to reconstitute what the grotto itself looked like and the activities of the cult. It was run by a lady called Narcissa, and she's still active today in the community. And she promoted a philosophy of there are no victims here. And that's really important because what it tried to establish was the idea that people who were anorexic should not see themselves as ill, They should not see themselves as medical patients. They should not see themselves as needing treatment. Instead, they should see themselves as practitioners of what she called volitional proactive anorexia, rather than someone who has an illness. So there's really that pushing to get rid of that victim mentality and to embrace an eating disorder as a core part of identity. And we see here one of the first declarations that pro-anorexia lifestyles are an actual process of profound internal and external transformation. The external transformation is obvious. People are losing vast quantities of weight, but it's also about an internal resolve and a profound spiritual strengthening. So she's saying it's both of these things. So if you have strength, if you have the willpower to refuse consumption, then you can be someone who is transformed through the power of eating disorders and through the help of the summoning of someone like ANAMADIM, who represents this sort of spiritual core to the movement. Now, there's a bit of debate as to whether ANAMADIM was created to fulfill a need or whether the spiritually gifted Narcissa contacted the pre-existing ANAMADIM using her telepathic skills. So basically within the community we have some people who are saying, no, it's actually an invented religion, we made this up at the turn of the century, it is something that we have constructed to fulfill an aim, versus others who say, no, she was actually already out there and our gifted telepathic leader found her and was able to find ways to communicate with her. So we have quite a split in the community as to whether or not she was invented or discovered. Now, in Project Shapeshift, which is a site run by Narcissa, she implies that ANAMADIM was created to help the community focus their religious energy on their anorexia. But her friend Mariah is the one who's really spreading this idea that Narcissa actually used goetic, Enochian, Thelemitic ceremonial magic to summon a goddess who was already in existence. And Narcissa is believed by some to be an initiate of the Western occultic orders. So she's actually been given quite a few mantles since she came up with ANAMADIM. And I think a lot of this is not true, but I also think it doesn't particularly matter in terms of the practice of this religion. Now, the oldest references I can find for a temple for ANAMADIM date back to July 28th, 2001, and it's completely lost, unfortunately. There was at some stage a pro-Ana consciousness raising temple, which is, it's gone, but the grotto itself does contain instructions on how to summon ANAMADIM using occult magic. So we actually do have very, very thorough records of the summoning processes that were put into this particular goddess. So I'll take you through those now because they're quite interesting, and I think it'll be clear to a lot of you who've studied the occult what they're drawing a lot of this influence from. So ANAMADIM can be summoned by performing a ritual at 1:47 a.m. upon the new moon, 1:47 being her sacred number. Now, if you wish to summon her, you should set up an altar facing the east and set up candles and incense to decorate. And the scent of the candles and incense needs to be something that the individual practitioner feels represents Ana energy. So it's fairly open in terms of the individual can decide what resonates the most for them. Then the altar itself does need to be adorned with offerings, quite a traditional process, but because these people are rejecting things like food, there's really no point, putting something on the altar that is the antithesis of the goddess herself. So what they've done is created this idea of anti-offerings. So because she's a goddess of nothing and of asceticism and of starvation, you have to put anti-offerings, so unhealthy food. The big suggestions are a cup of sugar, some white bread, some cookies, whatever it is that is the most sort of calorie-dense item that you can think of. If you want to give a gift to her, so something that she would approve of, you can use thermogenic weight loss tablets. They're illegal in most countries. A lot of the weight loss tablets are basically speed. But Americans do have access to quite a few of these things. So you can dissolve some tablets in water for her, and that can make a libation if you dissolve it in a goblet. So to actually start the ritual, we start to borrow from the Golden Dawn. So you should perform the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram from the Golden Dawn. And that's actually what's represented here in my image. This is a focus image for practitioners. Or a similar piece of ceremonial magic is also acceptable. You then need to align yourself with your inner center and your iron will. Really important, that idea of willfulness, because that's something that's trying to be summoned for the practitioner themselves. You then need to visualize glowing circles around your head in a sequence that adds up or that multiplies to 147. So we're doing a lot of visual imagery as part of this and as part of the summoning process. And then that pretty much sets you up for the summoning to be completed. The last elements of the summoning are you take the glowing circles in the multiples of 147, draw them into a triplicate rose, and bring them into the core of your body, then have their power radiate out through you. And in this state, ANAMADIM can finally appear to you. So you're in a position of readiness to actually receive her. Now, it's generally encouraged for practitioners to write their own invocation because it is meant to be something that is very personal about your own personal weaknesses or worries. But you can also use one that's supplied by the website. So the Grotto has quite an interesting invocation. And I put a quote here from it because I think this one really summarizes the kind of typical things that people are asking ANAMADIM to give to them. So you can ask her once she's appeared, shapeshift me to the image which forms the essence of desire and success. Empower me to embrace and endure the necessary deprivations and disciplines. Ensure that my efforts will not fall fallow upon the stones of dead weight, but liberate me to shred density. Tighten the fibres of my being and make light the vessel wherein I sojourn upon this earth. So quite a lofty way of basically saying, make me more resilient to eating, make my body smaller and tighter. But there's a lot of poetry involved in it. Now that ANAMADIM is present, she can speak to you. So it is meant to be a two-way communication process. So she might speak to a practitioner through trains of thought that enter into their mind. They might feel that they have a sudden insight, or they might feel that particular memories are coming to the surface. So if a practitioner is quiet and open-minded, through whatever form, they'll find that ANAMADIM can give them guidance, either immediately, or sometimes if you feel the ritual has failed, you're often told to look for further sites of guidance in the days to come. So it's also a good opportunity while ANAMADIM is present to make a pact with her. So in exchange for doing something useful for the cause more broadly, so you might say, okay, I'll make a new website. I will defend ANAMADIM against her critics. I will help other devotees to show willpower. I will give others the strength to fast all day. If you can help her in that kind of way, then she can help you back. So she can give you more strength. She can give you more willpower if you do something to further her own cause. And ideally, of course, the pact should be signed off in blood. Now, as the ritual is closed, it's important to thank ANAMADIM thoughtfully and then focus on returning back to the material world. So once you're back in the material world and once you're back in your body, then you can quickly record your thoughts and feelings so that you can keep track of any process or any signs that you have seen. Once the ritual is over, the anti-offering should be treated as bad juju and thrown in the bin or buried in the garden. And libations may be consumed by the practitioner during a time of need. So if you've dissolved your speed in the water, you are certainly welcome to consume that yourself because the ritual is now over. So that closes it up nicely. And that's pretty much the extent of ANAMADIM worship. Now, in more recent times, we move into the goddesses Anna and MEIDA. They are presently the ones who are popular. We saw ANAMADIM maybe from 2000 till about 2010 is when most memories of her had completely passed. And now this present decade, Anna and MEIDA are really at the forefront of the religion. And their names are abbreviations for anorexia and bulimia. The reason why I often use lowercase for them is simply because that's what the practitioners themselves often favour. Now, the most popular is Anna, and she's thought to have her own emotions and perform her own actions. So she can take control over individuals, and she can enforce behaviours upon them, and keeping up with her wishes and trying to avoid her disappointment are massively powerful motivations for a lot of devotees. She's seen as someone who's quite vengeful, so she can be a saviour that enlightens you and shows you the way, but she's also likely to manifest in a darker form as a demoness that haunts or possesses you. So she's kind of that idea of the loving but vengeful god. And you can see her again in this picture here on the right-hand side. The brunette lady is the victim. And in a somewhat of a Garden of Eden scenario, Anna is whispering in her ears, the blonde figure, saying, "Remember what I said, pretty girls don't eat." And at the same time, you can see that this lady here has been crying, and she also has quite a substantial self-harm wound on her arm as well. These are comorbid conditions, so not too unlikely that many people who are anorexic are also self-harmers. Now, Anna is a friend to a lot of people. A lady called Williams, who is part of the community for a long time, she summarises that anorexia wasn't a cold clinical mental illness. Anna was a wraith and a friend and a bully. Anna wanted the best for you. Anna wanted you all to herself. Anna reminded you of your failures. Anna kicked you while you were down. Even as a tortured teen, these haunting visions of Anna and MEIDA as bitchy, life-ruining girls that would beat you into submission until you broke and said thank you seemed a little melodramatic, but it rang true. Now, another current practitioner called Elle explains, "I will devote myself to Anna. She'll be with me wherever I go, keeping me in line. No one else matters. She is the only one who cares about me and who understands me. I will honour her and make her proud." So this is the kind of attitude that we see towards this goddess. I better hurry it up a bit because we're getting towards the end. But just to give you a brief idea of why I think we're falling into the territory of something that is a little bit more of a religion than religious ideas, is we do have a lot of ways to behave now which are in keeping with Anna and MEIDA. So we have here, for example, the 15 commandments of anorexia, but you can also find quite a lot of creeds as well. Most of them are some version of the Nicene Creed. They outline the pathway to a virtuous life under the guidance of Anna. If you follow them, you can show your goodness and strength. If you fail, it's a transgression worthy of Anna's punishment, which is usually self-inflicted. So how did this actually happen? How did people come to see anorexia as some sort of character outside of themselves? One of the reasons why it seems as though people have externalized this disease is there was a lot of therapy given to eating disorder patients in the 1990s, which continues on today. There was this particular therapeutic method where people were encouraged to see their anorexia as something that was completely external from themselves and encouraged them to view that they were an individual who had a problem, not an individual who was inherently problematic. So it's a way of shifting blame away from the patient themselves and making them, feel better about their actual inherent worth. Anorexia, bulimia, other problems like that were seen as these external forces that were troubling them, and that relationship could be removed. So we've really got a lot of people going through therapy being told that their anorexia is separate. So part of the healing process involved, discussing, got to wrap it up. Basically, so external figure. And then just to kind of say why I think these deities actually became so popular for people in this context is that they really do help. So yes, therapy is one thing, therapy can certainly help, but the opposite of therapy can be helpful as well. If you look at eating disorders like anorexia, they're a severe mental illness. They cause high level of suffering, and anorexia nervosa has the highest death rate of any psychiatric illness. They also tend to manifest in people who've undergone really severe traumas, like childhood sexual abuse. So if you look at goddesses like Anna, she provides friendship and support, but she also gives you control and predictable boundaries. And all of these things are really beneficial for people whose lives are lacking in these kind of things. It's also a great way of allowing taboo illnesses to become a part of coherence and group belonging rather than social exclusion. So I think basically one of the reasons why these goddesses have taken off so strongly is they suit the very special needs of the people who do suffer from psychiatric illnesses. Now, in case any of you want to chase up any of this material, my reference list is here, but I've also got a link where you can download these slides for yourself on my academia profile. And a much fuller version of this research is in my forthcoming monograph on the topic, which you can also purchase very soon, hopefully. But anyway, thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Zoe,
No worries.
for a wonderful, wonderful lecture. Yes, please.
Yeah, in all the groups, are any of them derived from AA? And are any of these other goddess groups influenced by AA?
It's in the AA milieu. So there have been a few people who have noted that at the time this therapy was emerging, it was at the same time as AA's sort of group therapy and group support model. So it was kind of coming out of the same milieu at the same time, but there's very little crossover in membership, mainly because these people are too young. So we're talking here about people who are not old enough to drink, whereas a lot of AA's membership is, old enough to be their parents. So there's not much crossover, but it was emerging. The very, very start of eating disorder support groups, from which these eventually came out of, was at the same time as AA. And a few correlations have been made, but essentially they remain separate just because the demographic crossover is not there.
Thank you. Yoram, please.
Yes.
It would be profitable to compare it with other female religions and to look at the distinctive kind of characters. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with Susan Serrett's book on female religions. I think it could be a very good comparative context. Of course, the fact that the female road to the holy is mediated by our body is an old stuff from Oli Anorexia and Caroline Bynum's stuff.
Yes.
This you are familiar with, I'm sure.
Yeah,
and from one last comment from a naturalistic perspective, we know that fasting is such a royal road to altered states of consciousness that this could be added as another explanation for the common apparitions of these goddesses.
Yeah, I think that that's fairly possible as well. When we look at the history of something like anorexia mirabilis, as it used to be before it was nervosa, it was seen as something that was a lot more socially acceptable. It was niche, but it was certainly something that people did respect as a way of being closer to God, being more pure, and also in some cases having ecstatic visions. And I think I could never prove it. I think it would be very impossible to go back in time and to say that any of these people have been hallucinating without, doing a full study into that I'm not qualified to do. But I think that would be a really interesting project for someone who's more in the field of psychology to actually go through and see what level of hallucination is reached through starvation, because these people are starving long term. They're fainting all the time, they're in a state of amenorrhea, they're gaining body hair, all of the sort of things that are there with fasting, so that are there with hallucinations from fasting. So I think it is very, very likely.
Thank you very much.
No worries, thank you.